Why get all your holiday decorations delivered through Instacart? Because maybe you only bought 2 wreaths but have 12 windows. Or maybe your toddler got very eager with the advent calendar. Or maybe the inflatable snowman didn't make it through the snowstorm. Or maybe the twinkle lights aren't twinkling. Whatever the reason, this season, Instacart's here for hosts and their whole holiday haul. Get decorations from the Home Depot, CVS, and more through Instacart and enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
He's now the focus of a sensational story in Scotland. A Rhode Islander suspected of faking his death to run from the law, then arrested a couple years later in the UK, claiming to be someone else. Before that, Nicholas Alahverdian had been on the news a few times years earlier as an advocate for child welfare reform. And in the months before the COVID pandemic, he was reaching out to news reporters again with what later certainly appeared to be a sham story about himself.
From WJAR in Providence, Rhode Island, this is NBC 10 True Crime International Mystery.
I'm talking today with former NBC 10 I-Team reporter and my former colleague Parker Gavigan, who had dealings and interactions with Nicholas Alahverdian a couple years ago in the time around his supposed death in Rhode Island. Parker, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Before we get back kind of into your history there, just tell me what you make of the news over the past few months with this man in Scotland who they alleged to be Nicholas Alahverdian, who you were led to believe had died a few years ago in Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's a wild story. I mean, truly is. I don't think anyone would believe it. It's straight out of Hollywood. The fact that COVID happened and he appears in a hospital in Scotland, and then the authorities grab him. I mean, it's unreal.
And now just take me back to how it all started with you and him back a few years ago when you were working here at NBC 10.
Yeah, so it was in early 2020, before COVID, and he had reached out. He said that he had cancer and was dying, and I could tell that he was sort of making the rounds. He was talking to other media, and so at the time, I remember we published a story because he was a child welfare advocate over the years. I remember publishing a story on our website that he was dying of cancer. However, at the time, or shortly thereafter, he reached out again, and he sort of pitched a story to me that he had been abused, assaulted by a now prominent Rhode Island politician, and sort of wanted to get this story off of his chest before he died. Now, he claimed he was living overseas. He claimed he was living in Russia, but could meet us somewhere in Europe if we flew, met him, and interviewed him. And so he was pitching hard, really gave me a hard sell to put together this story before his supposed death.
And at that time, was there any reason to doubt whether he was actually sick? Or, and again, like with somebody trying to pitch a story like that, obviously you'd probably start with a lot of skepticism, but what did you think of him at that point?
Well, it was tough. It was tough to say at the time. I obviously had a lot of skepticism about his accusations. I think, anybody who is a journalist, you've got to look at things in that way to get to the truth. I didn't suspect that he was dying. I didn't think that anybody would necessarily make that kind of news up. But we clearly had some doubts about his story and what he could prove. Would it just be his word against that politician's? And what could he prove? I clearly expressed that to him. He was upset. He really was pushing for this story hard. And that's where we left it. And that's when the world shut down and we sort of forgot about Nicholas Alahverdian for a time.
But you would let it be known that you weren't going to go meet him in Europe?
Yeah, I let him know that. He wasn't happy. I mean, he was persistent. He was pushy. He, claimed he had evidence, but he wouldn't really tell me what it was. There just wasn't enough there for us to make a trip to Europe on a whim.
And at that point, did you think that was the end of it? And then was there some other contact later on?
Well, I'll say this, prior to his death, he did put a woman on the phone with me who had a British accent. He claimed he got married, met a woman in Europe, and got married, had a few kids. And he at the time, he claimed he was dying and he was in Russia, but he did put someone else on the phone that he claimed was his wife, Louise. So I did have a conversation with this supposed Louise. And again, she was, I don't want to say that she was advocating for the story. It was more like he wanted me to have this conversation with her, to talk more about the personal side, his family life, his children. Although he never named his kids, and he never told me how old they were either.
And then is Louise the one who then reached out to say he had died? Is that how it worked?
Yeah, I kind of forget exactly how it worked out. Whether we got an email from her directly, whether I got an email from her directly. They had put up this Alahverdian family office prior to his death. So press releases were, if I'm not mistaken, I think the original press release about his cancer diagnosis came from the Alahverdian office, which I found odd. It was definitely strange. I mean, who has a family office who isn't like a wealthy person doing, philanthropy work? It was odd.
Yeah.
So I feel like we got an email from the Alahverdian family office saying he had died, and Louise also reached out about that time, wondering if I could offer some kind words, condolences to a website, really a tribute for Nicholas.
And was that, I guess, and what was her personality like? This is the person, and did you speak to her on the phone again? Or I don't know if you remember, or was it kind of the same as before when he put her on the phone?
I don't think at that time, after his alleged death, that I spoke to her on the phone. I think that was all through, if I remember correctly, that was all through email. And her demeanor at the time was, the words on the screen, I mean, it all sounded real. She sounded like she was a widow and saddened and, looking for an outlet for that grief and putting together a tribute page of sorts. But as sort of the days progressed and I hadn't done that, she became more persistent, and I could tell agitated, and sort of came at me with the same persistence that he had when he was pitching his story to us.
So probably not surprising in my interactions with the person in Scotland who says he's Arthur Knight. There's been a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, a lot of back and forth. Why don't you look into that? Why I have documentation on this, but does that all sound like it fits the same MO?
To the T, Brian, to the T. And listen, I've heard the interviews with Arthur Knight. I spent a lot of time on the phone with Nicholas Alahverdian. Arthur Knight has the same cadence to his voice. there's no doubt in my mind that's the same person.
Right. And then again, that's from you talking on the phone and now seeing there's now been multiple television interviews. We did one with us, and in the UK, he's done some now as well. Yeah, you think it's not the accent, but the way he talked that has you convinced?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the guy has a British accent, that's clear. But the cadence of his voice, the rhythm of his voice, identical to Nicholas Alahverdian.
When you saw that he had popped up in Scotland, now the Providence Journal had done a story the year in the middle that police suspected that he might have faked his death. So was it all surprising when they said he popped up in Scotland, or had you been hearing about that as well?
Him popping up in Scotland was a surprise. You know, a year after his alleged death, rumblings had started to come out that he faked his death. I had talked to law enforcement in that year in Rhode Island, and they believed he had faked his death. We hadn't reported that. I at the time we just didn't have enough to put a story together. But I did have conversations with law enforcement that they believed he faked his death. They believed that he was, possibly if he lived in the United States, that he might even show up at his own funeral. And later on that summer of 2020, when the world and the state, everybody was in lockdown, these two funeral events got moved, canceled, pushed aside. Law enforcement thought that he was so narcissistic that he might try to show up at his own funeral and see the procession and listen to these glowing eulogies that folks might have to say about himself.
Right, and evidently they did try to plan a couple of funerals that in the end got scrapped when the state police reached out to the churches. Yeah, they definitely got scrapped.
But yes, it was when he popped up in Scotland in a hospital stricken with COVID. It was a surprise. I think law enforcement just thought he went underground and didn't know where exactly where he was.
And at the time of his supposed death, I think we've come to learn now that law enforcement in a couple of other states was looking for him. Did you get the sense that at that time in that middle period of time that law enforcement was letting that on as well, that he potentially faked his own death to escape authorities in other states? Because I think from the outside, you were like, most of us probably would have been like, why would he do such a thing?
Right. I think, yes, we did learn that later on that there were some charges that he faced out west in Utah, and that was a likely reason that he skipped town.
And then when you saw that, again, that news in Scotland, before hearing his voice, it was so hard to get a good picture of him. He was always wearing a hat. He had a mask on. What went through your mind as to, again, having dealt with this person on the phone a couple of years prior, that now he's the focus of a sensational international story?
Yeah, you're right. It was difficult to get a good look at him because he was always covering his face, whether it was the beard and the oxygen mask and the hat, and he's in the wheelchair and he's hunched over. But I will say, your interview with Arthur Knight, where he's able to take off that mask, and you can get a clearer look at his face, and when you juxtapose that with Nicholas Alahverdian from some of the video that we have of him, I'd say that's a pretty good match as well. But what was striking to me was the voice, despite the accent, despite the British accent, his voice. And this is somebody who I spent hours on the phone with. I mean, when I tell you I couldn't get this guy off the phone, I really couldn't get him off the phone. I literally would have to make up excuses and say, I'm sorry, Nick, I've got to go. I've got to go. So when I heard his voice, it was so clear to me that this is Nicholas Alahverdian.
Right. And the phone calls I've had with Arthur Knight, supposedly in Scotland, it's, again, the phone calls don't usually last any less than 20 to 30 minutes. And again, you're right. He'll talk on the phone for a long time. And he seemed to know a lot about Nicholas Alahverdian's situation back here in Rhode Island and in Utah for somebody who claimed he didn't know, or he's not that person.
That's an odd part of this. Why is a guy who is presumably, a case of mistaken identity in Scotland, why does he care so much about Nicholas Alahverdian in terms of reaching out to media outlets in Rhode Island? Why does he care so much about clearing any supposed misinformation about Nicholas Alahverdian in Rhode Island? I mean, if you're a guy who's living your best life in Scotland in a case of mistaken identity, why do you care?
And so again, you said you've seen these interviews, both ours and the ones he's done in the United Kingdom, and in all of them, he denies that he is this Rhode Islander who's on the run. It would seem that most people do not believe that. Clearly, you don't believe it either. I mean, he's adamant.
No, I don't believe him. I don't. And again, I saw in your interview as well, you rightly asked him to show you his arms. He shows you his forearms, but there's some indication there that some tattoos might have been removed from his forearm. Clearly from those old mug shots, he's got a sleeve of tattoos going high up on the bicep and up to the shoulder. If you're really not him, take your shirt off, put on a t-shirt. I mean, is there a reason this guy has to be in a tweed jacket and have a hat on?
The other thing I have found somewhat interesting is that, he reaches out to these media outlets, including us, when you don't have to do that. You're someone who's being accused of serious crimes. And maybe I'm wrong. In your time, you and I have both done this job for a significant period of time. People who are accused of crimes like that don't usually reach out to the news to tell their story. Sometimes they do. But for him to kind of go on this media blitz, and again, contacting media in the United States when he claims he's never been here, would also seem to fit the pattern of Nicholas Alahverdian. Yeah.
Yeah, it's super odd, and fits the pattern of Nicholas Alahverdian to a T.
And again, you did this job for a while. You did lots of stories. At the time, and it seems that you're right. You're saying you remember the cadence of his voice at the time when you were going through these interactions with him. Were you thinking that these are interactions or a story that I'll remember for a long time in my career, or was it something in passing at the time? You're like, I don't know where this is going, and my guess is this is the end of it.
Yeah, more the latter. I think it was just it felt like it. This is something that would pass. I really didn't think too much of it, and when COVID hit and the world shut down and our lives changed dramatically, I really didn't think I would hear the name Nicholas Alahverdian again, or predict that it would go in this direction that it's gone, which is just straight out of Hollywood. It's just such a strange, bizarre story. Really.
Right. Those conversations with him though left a mark that you remember the way he talked and the pattern and the style now a couple of years later.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you spend the amount of time that I spent with him on the phone listening to him, because 95% of those conversations were one way, him talking, me listening. Yeah, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what he sounds like, and I'm by no means the closest to him. I was just a reporter at the time, so I know that there are those who have spent years and more than a decade with him and around him and had conversations with him that I'm sure would also say the same thing, that Arthur Knight sounds really, really similar to Nicholas Alahverdian, despite the accent.
All right, Parker, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you for joining us, and of course, we'll see what happens next in this saga. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, real interesting stuff. Stay on it.
In the years before his supposed death, Nicholas Alahverdian was also no stranger to investigators at Rhode Island State Police. Troopers were looking for him, but could not find him. You'll hear about their interactions with Alahverdian, investigators' thoughts on his disappearance, and their suspicions when an obituary for Alahverdian popped up. All on the next NBC 10 True Crime International Mystery.